Wyoming's bitter wind howled across Oakhaven's wooden platform, slashing through Claire Higgins's threadbare coat. She stood paralyzed, knuckles white around a battered satchel, as her future shattered into jagged ruin. Arthur Pendleton, the wealthy merchant she had crossed a continent to marry, had just sneered at her weary face, declared her entirely unsuitable, and abandoned her to the merciless frontier dust. Destitution loomed cold and absolute, stinging her eyes with unshed tears. Suddenly, a broad-shouldered shadow eclipsed the dying sun. Smelling of pine and saddle leather, a stranger leaned close. His gravelly voice cut through the gale. "Let him walk. My twins need a mother like you." The year was 1882, and the town of Oakhaven, Wyoming, was little more than a violent gash of civilization carved into the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Claire Higgins had spent 4 agonizing days on a soot-choked Union Pacific train, surviving on stale biscuits and the desperate hope folded neatly in her bodice. It was a letter from Mr. Arthur Pendleton, a supposedly prosperous merchant and ranch owner, promising her a life of respectability, comfort, and, above all, a home. Claire was 24, an age considered perilously close to spinsterhood in Boston. After the typhoid outbreak took her parents and left her penniless, the mail-order bride advertisements in the Eastern Star newspaper seemed less like a gamble and more like a lifeline. Arthur's letters had been eloquent, painting pictures of rolling green pastures and a grand Victorian house that needed a woman's refined touch. When the train finally hissed to a halt, expelling a cloud of white steam over the dusty platform, Claire smoothed the front of her only decent dress, a faded navy bombazine, and stepped down. She scanned the smattering of rough-hewn faces, prospectors, drifters, and saloon girls. Among them stood a man in a tailored broadcloth suit and a pristine bowler hat. He held a silver-tipped cane, his posture rigid with impatience. "Mr. Pendleton?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly as she approached him. Arthur Pendleton turned. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and pale, calculating eyes. Those eyes swept over Claire, taking in her scuffed boots, the frayed cuffs of her coat, and her exhausted, pale face. The smile he had worn for the arriving passengers vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. "You cannot be Claire Higgins," Arthur said, his tone dripping with revulsion. "The woman in the photograph sent to me was radiant, robust. She wore silk. That photograph. It belonged to my cousin," Claire stammered, the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. "I explained in my second letter. Mr. Pendleton, the photographer in Boston, charged $3 for a portrait, money I did not possess. But my letters, my words, were entirely my own." Arthur scoffed, loudly enough that a nearby group of cowhands turned to watch. "Your words do not warm a bed or impress the town council, Miss Higgins. I paid for a prize, not a scullery maid. But I have traveled 2,000 miles, Claire whispered, her grip tightening on her satchel until her knuckles turned white. "I have exactly 40 cents to my name. You promised me a marriage. You signed a contract predicated on a falsehood," Arthur retorted, tapping his cane sharply against the wooden platform. "Consider yourself fortunate I do not have you arrested for fraud. You are not the woman I agreed to marry, and I wash my hands of this entire pathetic affair. Good day to you, Miss Higgins." Without another word, Arthur Pendleton turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the dusty thoroughfare of Oakhaven. Claire stood paralyzed. The hum of the station faded into a dull roar in her ears. She was completely alone. The boarding house across the street advertised rooms for $2 a night, money she didn't have. The ticket agent was already locking his booth. The sun was beginning its descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long, ominous shadows across the dirt road. She swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears fall, though her chest heaved with the effort. She would not beg. She would not scream. But a cold terror began to freeze the blood in her veins. "He's a fool, and a blind one at that." The voice came from right behind her, deep, resonant, and rough as unpolished stone. Claire gasped and spun around, nearly dropping her bag. Leaning casually against the brick wall of the station house was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the Wyoming mountainside. He wore a faded canvas duster coated in pale trail dust, a battered Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a pair of worn leather chaps. A Colt Peacemaker rested casually at his hip. He pushed off the wall and stepped into the dying light. His face was weathered, marked by a faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow. But his eyes were a startling, piercing shade of steel blue. He wasn't classically handsome like Arthur Pendleton. He was rugged, dangerous, and undeniably real. I beg your pardon, Claire said, taking a defensive step back. Pendleton, the man said, taking off his hat and revealing thick, dark hair. He's a cheat and a liar. The only thing he owns in this town is a mountain of debt and a loud mouth. You dodged a bullet, ma'am, even if it feels right now like you just caught one in the chest. I am not in the habit of discussing my private affairs with strangers, Claire said, lifting her chin, trying to summon the Boston dignity that was rapidly failing her. Fair enough. Name's Samir. Samir Lewis. He didn't offer his hand, perhaps sensing she wouldn't take it. Instead, he studied her with an unnerving intensity. He looked at her frayed cuffs, her stubborn jaw, and the unshed tears shining in her eyes. You didn't cry, he noted. You didn't beg him. You just stood your ground. Crying serves no practical purpose, Mr. Lewis. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Practical. Good. I need practical. Samir shifted his weight, looking out toward the mountains. I have a ranch out at Blackwood Creek. It's a harsh patch of land, about 15 miles from here. It takes grit to survive it. But more than that, I have a problem. Claire frowned, clutching her bag tighter. I am not a charity case, Mr. Lewis, nor am I a woman of ill repute. If you are suggesting I have twins, Samir interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a sudden, heavy weight. 5 years old? Caleb and Sadie, their mother. She passed 2 years ago in a blizzard. Since then, I've tried hiring nannies, housekeepers, anyone. They all leave. The kids are wild. The ranch is isolated, and I don't have the time to raise them right and keep the cattle from starving. They need a mother. A real one. Someone who doesn't break when the wind blows too hard. He stepped closer, and Claire caught the scent of him, wood smoke, horses, and clean sweat. Let him go, Samir whispered, gesturing his head toward the town where Arthur had vanished. My twins need a mother like you. I watched you stand up to the richest bully in Oakhaven with 40 cents in your pocket. That's the kind of spine my children need to learn from. Claire stared at him. You are asking me to marry you? A man I met 3 minutes ago? I'm asking for a partnership, Miss Higgins. A legal marriage to protect your reputation, yes. I'll provide a roof, food, safety, and a name. In exchange, you bring order to my home and raise my children. No romance, no lies, just survival. It was a stark, unromantic proposition. Yet, looking into Samir Lewis's steady blue eyes, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of absolute honesty. He wasn't promising her a grand house or a life of luxury. He was offering her hard work and a mutual need. She looked at the darkening sky, then at the desolate town. She had no money, no fame. Do you have a wagon, Mr. Lewis? Claire asked, her voice steadying. Samir's eyes sparked with genuine respect. I do. Then let us go to the magistrate. But hear me now, Claire said, pointing a slender gloved finger at his chest. I expect to be treated with respect as a partner in this endeavor, and I expect my own room. Done, Samir said. He finally reached out, taking her heavy leather satchel from her trembling hands as easily as if it were a feather. Welcome to Wyoming, Mrs. Lewis. The ride to Blackwood Creek was a journey into another world. As the buckboard wagon left Oakhaven behind, the landscape transformed into a harsh, breathtaking expanse of sagebrush, towering pines, and jagged rock formations that looked like the teeth of sleeping giants. Claire sat stiffly beside her new husband, the plain gold band Samir had purchased at the general store feeling heavy and strange on her finger. They arrived at the ranch well after dark, The house was not the grand Victorian Arthur had promised, but a sprawling, sturdy log cabin, built solidly against a backdrop of imposing mountains. No warm light spilled from the windows. It sat in dark, brooding silence. "Wait here," Samir murmured, securing the reins. He lit a kerosene lantern and helped Claire down. As they approached the heavy oak door, Claire could hear the faint sound of scuffling from inside. Samir pushed the door open, holding the lantern high. The great room was vast, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall, but it was in a state of utter chaos. Blankets were strewn across the floor, half-eaten biscuits littered a heavy wooden table, and a thick layer of dust coated the mantel. "Caleb? Sadie?" Samir called out, his voice softer than Claire had heard it before. From beneath the large dining table, 2 pairs of eyes reflected the lantern light. Claire knelt slowly, uncaring of the dirt on her only dress. "Hello," she said gently. 2 small children crept out from the shadows. They were feral little things, with tangled dark hair and smudges of soot on their faces. The boy, Caleb, stepped protectively in front of his sister, holding a wooden spoon like a weapon. Sadie peeked out from behind him, clutching a ragged cloth doll with missing button eyes. "Who's she?" Caleb demanded, his voice defensive. "This is Claire," Samir said, setting the lantern down. "She's going to be staying with us. She's your new mother." "Don't want a new mother," Caleb shot back, glaring at Claire. "The last one ran away crying because I put a bull snake in her boots." Claire didn't blink. She stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Well, Caleb, it is a good thing I am from Boston. I do not own boots that a bull snake would find appealing, and I prefer my reptiles outside. Furthermore, if you attempt to frighten me, you will find I am remarkably immune to childish pranks. Now, where is the soap? Both of you look as though you've been rolling in the ash pit." Samir raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his stoic face. The children, unused to an adult who didn't immediately yell or recoil, stared at her in stunned silence. For the next 3 days, Claire worked like a woman possessed. She scrubbed floors, boiled linens, and cooked hearty, simple meals with the provisions Samir had brought from town. She didn't try to force affection on the twins. Instead, she provided structure. Meals were at specific times, hands were washed, bedtimes were enforced. Slowly, the wildness in Caleb and Sadie began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the strange Eastern woman who knew how to make apple cobbler out of dried fruit and who didn't flinch when the coyotes howled at night. But Claire soon realized that the dust in the house was nothing compared to the shadows hanging over Samir. He worked from dawn until dusk, driving himself to the point of exhaustion. He rarely spoke, and he never entered the small room at the end of the hall, the room Claire realized must have belonged to his late wife, Sarah. The true danger of Blackwood Creek, however, revealed itself on the morning of her 2nd week. Claire was hanging laundry on the line out back when the thunder of hooves echoed through the valley. 3 men rode into the yard, kicking up dust and pulling their horses to a violent halt. Claire dropped her basket, her heart leaping into her throat. She recognized the horses from town. These were Arthur Pendleton's men, the leader, a greasy-haired brute named Vance Noe, a man named Hiram. Claire corrected her frantic thoughts, remembering the faces from the station spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the porch steps. "Lewis," Hiram bellowed, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. Samir emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in his hand. His body was coiled tight with tension. "State your business, Hiram, and get off my land." "Mr. Pendleton sent us," Hiram sneered, his eyes drifting over to Claire with a predatory glint. "Says you owe him for the grazing rights by the ridge. And he says he hears you picked up his discarded trash from the station. He wants $100 for the inconvenience she caused him." Claire gasped at the sheer audacity of the lie. Arthur had rejected her. "Pendleton doesn't own the ridge, and he sure as hell doesn't own my wife." Samir's voice was deadly quiet. He didn't raise the pitchfork. He simply dropped it and let his hand brush against the grip of his Colt. "Now, Samir, don't be a hero," another rider chuckled, unholstering his weapon. Before Samir could draw, Claire moved. She didn't think. She just reacted. She grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle Samir kept propped by the kitchen door, marched onto the porch, and racked the lever with a loud, terrifying clack that echoed across the yard. She aimed it squarely at Hiram's chest. "My husband told you to get off our land," Claire said, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, devoid of the fear she felt. "In Boston, we consider trespassing a severe offense. Out here, I am told it is a fatal one. I have 40 cents to my name, gentlemen, and I will not hesitate to spend it on bullets to defend my family." Hiram stared at the barrel of the rifle, then up at Claire's unwavering, fierce eyes. He looked at Samir, who had already drawn his Colt with blinding speed, covering the other two men. "Crazy Eastern witch," Hiram muttered, slowly raising his hands and backing his horse up. "Pendleton ain't gonna like this. Tell Arthur Pendleton," Claire called out as they turned their horses, "that if he ever sends his lapdogs to my home again, he will deal with me personally." As the riders galloped away in a cloud of dust, Claire lowered the rifle. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She began to shake, the adrenaline leaving her system in a rush. Samir holstered his gun and walked over to her. He took the rifle from her trembling hands and set it aside. Then, for the first time since they had met, he reached out and gently pulled her into his chest. He smelled of sweat, leather, and gunpowder, and Claire buried her face in his shirt, gripping his arms as she steadied herself. "You didn't flinch," Samir whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion Claire couldn't quite name. "I told you," Claire replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "I am remarkably immune to intimidation." Samir pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes. The cold, impenetrable wall he usually kept up had cracked. "You protected them," he said, looking past her to where Caleb and Sadie were watching from the window, their eyes wide with awe. "You protected us. We are partners, Samir," Claire said softly. "Yeah," Samir murmured, his thumb brushing away a streak of dirt from her cheek. Partners. But as he looked at her, Claire realized with a sudden, terrifying jolt that the terms of their practical, emotionless arrangement had just been irrevocably altered. The shadows of Blackwood Creek were deep, but she had just struck a match in the dark. Autumn swept through the Wyoming territory, not with a gentle change of colors, but with a biting, relentless wind that stripped the cottonwoods bare and turned the earth hard as iron. Inside the Lewis cabin, however, a new warmth had taken root. Claire had spent the last 2 months transforming the sprawling log structure from a house of mourning into a home. The heavy drapes were pulled back to let in the pale sunlight. The scent of lye soap had been replaced by the aroma of baking bread and roasting venison, and the silent tension had given way to the occasional sound of children laughing. Caleb and Sadie had ceased their rebellious pranks. Claire's unflinching consistency and quiet, firm affection had won them over. Caleb now trailed after her like a shadow, helping carry firewood, while Sadie spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, watching Claire mend shirts, her little rag doll finally boasting 2 newly sewn button eyes. Yet, the peace inside the cabin was a fragile membrane against the mounting pressure outside. Samir was working himself to the bone. The cattle needed to be moved to the winter pastures in the Box Canyon, and the fences required mending before the heavy snows hit. The brief moment of vulnerability he had shared with Claire after the confrontation with Hiram had been locked away again beneath a stoic, guarded exterior. They were partners, sharing meals and the burden of the ranch, but the boundary of their arrangement remained firmly drawn. She slept in the spare room. He slept in the heavy oak bed in the main room. The uneasy truce broke on a frigid Tuesday when Samir and Claire rode the buckboard into Oak Haven for winter provisions. The town had grown uglier in the weeks since Claire's arrival. Tents and shanties had sprouted along the outskirts, filled with surveyors and desperate laborers. As Samir loaded sacks of flour and salt pork into the back of the wagon outside Miller's Mercantile, Claire stepped out onto the boardwalk, wrapping her wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Well, if it isn't the mail order mistake," Claire stiffened. Arthur Pendleton was stepping out of the assayer's office, flanked by Sheriff Amos Sterling, a man whose badge looked as tarnished as his reputation. Arthur wore a heavy, fur-lined coat, and a smug, victorious smile. "Mr. Pendleton," Claire said coldly, keeping her spine rigid. "I must admit, Claire, you look exactly as destitute as the day I discarded you at the station." Arthur sneered, stepping closer. "Tell me, how is life in the dirt with a bankrupt widower? Is he paying you wages, or merely letting you eat his table scraps?" Sheriff Sterling chuckled, a wet, wheezing sound. Before Claire could formulate a sufficiently sharp retort, a heavy hand clamped onto Arthur's shoulder, spinning the wealthy merchant around with enough force to make him stumble. Samir stood there, his steel blue eyes burning with a quiet, lethal fury. "Address my wife with disrespect again, Pendleton, and I won't bother drawing my gun. I'll break your jaw with my bare hands." Samir growled, his voice a low rumble that carried over the street noise. Arthur batted Samir's hand away, adjusting his lapels, though a flicker of genuine fear crossed his pale eyes. "You violent brute. This is exactly why the bank is calling in your markers, Lewis. You lack the civility required for modern enterprise." "I don't owe the bank a dime," Samir shot back. "Ah, but you owe me." Arthur smiled, a slick, venomous expression. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of heavy parchment. "I bought your outstanding notes from the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne last week. I own your debts now, Samir, and I am calling them in. By the end of the month, you will pay me the $2,000 you owe, or I will foreclose on Blackwood Creek and take the land." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. $2,000 was an astronomical sum. It was more than the entire herd was worth. "Why?" Claire demanded, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Samir. "Why go to such lengths to ruin us? You have your town. You have your wealth." Arthur looked at her, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. "Because, my dear, uneducated Claire, the new Burlington Northern Railroad spur is scheduled to cut straight through the Wyoming foothills, and the only viable grade for the tracks goes right through the Blackwood Creek Valley. The land isn't worth spit for grazing, but to the railroad, it's worth a fortune. A fortune I intend to collect." He tipped his bowler hat to her. "You backed the wrong horse, Claire. You could have been wearing silk in my parlor. Instead, you'll be freezing in a sod hut by December. Good day to you both." As Arthur and the sheriff walked away, Samir stood frozen, his jaw clenching so hard Claire thought his teeth might shatter. The weight of the world seemed to crash down upon his broad shoulders. Claire reached out, her gloved hand gently covering his bruised, calloused knuckles. "Samir," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the dust kicked up by Pendleton's boots. "I failed them," he said, his voice hollow. "I failed Sarah, and now I've failed the twins. And you have failed no one," Claire said fiercely, her Boston steel flashing in her eyes. "He is a coward playing parlor tricks with paper. We have the land, we have the cattle, and we have each other. We will fight him." Samir finally turned his head to look at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. He found none. The fierce loyalty in her eyes struck a chord deep within his chest, shattering another piece of the icy wall he had built around his heart. Nature, it seemed, was determined to collude with Arthur Pendleton. 3 days before the end of the month, the sky over the Bighorns bruised a deep, violently purple hue. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour, and the wind began to howl with a demonic ferocity. An early, brutal blizzard was sweeping down the mountain, carrying a wall of blinding white snow. "I have to get the stragglers into the canyon," Samir shouted over the roaring wind, wrestling his heavy canvas slicker on by the door. "If they freeze out on the open range, we lose our only asset. We won't have a prayer of fighting Pendleton's foreclosure. It's madness to go out in this," Claire pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was wrapping a thick wool scarf around his neck, her hands lingering against his cold skin. "You can't see 10 feet in front of you." "I have to, Claire. Keep the fire stoked. Keep the twins away from the windows." He paused, looking down at her. In the dim lantern light of the cabin, the space between them seemed to suddenly vanish. He reached up, cupping her face in his large, gloved hand. It was an intimate, desperate gesture. "If I don't make it back by dawn, take the hidden money under the floorboards. Take the children. Get on the first train east. Do not speak like that," Claire said, her voice cracking. "You will come back. You promised me a partnership, Samir Lewis, and I do not tolerate breach of contract." A raw, beautiful smile broke across his face. He leaned down and pressed his lips firmly to her forehead, a seal, a promise, a prayer. Then, he tore the door open and plunged into the screaming white void. Hours bled into a terrifying, agonizing night. Claire paced the floor, feeding the fire until the cast-iron stove glowed dull red. Caleb and Sadie slept huddled together beneath a mountain of quilts on the rug, oblivious to the storm raging outside and the terror clawing at Claire's throat. By midnight, the wind shifted, bringing with it a sound that made Claire's blood run cold. It wasn't the howl of the storm. It was the sharp, distinct crack of a rifle shot. Claire rushed to the frosted window, wiping away the condensation. She could see nothing but a swirling vortex of snow. Another shot rang out, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the eastern ridge. Pendleton. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Pendleton wasn't going to wait for the bank. He had sent his men to scatter the herd or kill Samir under the cover of the blizzard, ensuring the Lewis ranch would be utterly destroyed. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed Samir's spare coat, a pair of oversized boots, and the heavy Winchester rifle from the mantel. She stuffed her pockets with extra cartridges. "Stay here," she whispered to the sleeping twins, locking the heavy cabin door behind her as she stepped out. The cold was an immediate, physical assault. It stole her breath and bit into her skin like needles. She fought her way toward the barn, saddled Samir's massive roan gelding, Goliath, with trembling, frozen fingers, and rode out into the tempest. She trusted the horse's instincts more than her own blinded eyes, letting Goliath pick his way toward the ridge. The snow was drifting high, but the wind occasionally tore gaps in the white curtain. Through one such gap, she saw a flicker of orange flame, a lantern. She spurred the horse forward, her hands completely numb on the reins. As she crested a small rise, the scene below materialized like a nightmare. A group of cattle was scattered and panicked. Two men on horseback were swinging ropes, driving the frightened beast toward the deadly drop-off of the ravine. And there, pinned beneath his fallen, thrashing horse, was Samir. One of the riders, a hulking man named Jebediah Rust, known in town for his cruelty, was turning his horse toward Samir, raising his rifle to finish the job. A feral, unladylike scream ripped from Claire's throat. She didn't bother aiming gracefully. She hoisted the Winchester to her shoulder, leveraged it against Goliath's neck, and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her collarbone, but the shot cracked through the freezing air like thunder. The bullet struck the snow inches from Jebediah's horse, causing the animal to rear up violently. Jebediah was thrown backward, landing hard in a snowdrift. "Leave him be," Claire screamed into the wind, jacking another shell into the chamber and firing again, this time shattering the lantern the other rider was holding. Darkness and snow swallowed them. The sheer shock of an ambush in the middle of a blizzard, coupled with the lethal crack of the Winchester, was enough for Pendleton's hired guns. Cowards at heart, they scrambled onto their mounts and spurred them away, disappearing into the storm. Claire slid off Goliath, the snow plunging past her knees, and waded desperately toward Samir. He was struggling to push his dead horse off his crushed leg, his face pale and contorted in agony. "Claire?" he gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief as she dropped to her knees beside him. "What? What are you doing here?" "Saving my investment, you foolish man," she sobbed, tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. She wedged the barrel of the rifle under the saddle horn, using it as a lever to pry the dead weight just enough for Samir to drag his shattered leg free. He cried out, a raw sound of pain, as she hauled him upright. He was heavy, his blood staining the pristine snow, but Claire felt a surge of adrenaline that rivaled the storm. She practically carried him to Goliath, shoving and lifting him into the saddle before climbing up behind him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist to keep him from falling. The ride back was an eternity of freezing darkness. When they finally reached the cabin, Claire had to drag Samir inside, leaving a trail of melted snow and blood across the floorboards. She stripped him of his frozen clothes by the fire, her hands moving with frantic, efficient desperation. His leg was broken, a jagged, ugly fracture, and a bullet had grazed his side, leaving a bloody, weeping trench. As she bound his ribs tightly with torn strips of linen and set his leg with pieces of firewood, Samir watched her. His eyes were heavy with pain and exhaustion, but they never left her face. "You came from me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I told you," Claire said, her voice fierce and trembling as she smoothed the damp hair from his forehead. "I do not break when the wind blows too hard, and I do not abandon my family." Samir reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. The pretense of a business arrangement, the walls of the practical partnership, they all burned away in the heat of the fire and the stark reality of survival. "You're not just my partner, Claire," Samir murmured, his eyes slipping shut as the exhaustion claimed him. "You're my heart." Claire sat beside him on the floor, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart against the howling of the wind. Pendleton had tried to bury them in the snow, but he had only succeeded in forging them into something unbreakable. For 2 weeks, the Blackwood Creek cabin became a sanctuary of healing and quiet, desperate labor. The blizzard had locked the Wyoming territory in a fortress of ice, effectively severing them from the outside world and, mercifully, from Arthur Pendleton. Samir was confined to the heavy oak bed in the main room. Claire had set his leg with a brutal, necessary efficiency, and though a high fever had ravaged him for 3 days, his iron constitution ultimately won out. During that time, Claire became the undisputed master of the ranch. She bundled herself in 3 layers of wool and Samir's oversized canvas coat, trudging through waist-deep drifts to feed the livestock in the sheltered box canyon, chopping firewood until her hands were blistered and raw, and tending to her husband and the twins. Caleb and Sadie watched their new mother with a reverence bordering on awe. To them, the delicate Eastern woman who had arrived at the train station was gone, replaced by a fierce, soot-stained pioneer who had chased away the monsters in the snow. It was on a Tuesday, while searching for a fresh length of linen in Samir's iron lockbox, that Claire discovered the anomaly. Beneath a stack of old receipts and Sarah's silver locket, Claire found the original land patent for Blackwood Creek, signed by the territorial governor, John W. Hoyt, in 1878. As she traced the heavy ink of the boundaries, her mind snagged on a crucial detail. She pulled Arthur Pendleton's foreclosure notice from her apron pocket, the paper he had so smugly shoved in her face in Oakhaven. Claire was not a lawyer, but in Boston, she had worked for 3 years as a clerk for her late uncle, a magistrate. She knew how to read a deed. "Samir," she said, carrying the papers to the bedside. Her heart was beating a rapid, thrilling rhythm against her ribs. "Look at the surveyor's seal on Pendleton's note." Samir pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing as his cracked ribs protested. He squinted at the paper. "It's stamped 1,880 from the Cheyenne assayer." "Exactly," Claire said, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "But look at your original patent. The boundaries were redrawn by the Federal Land Office in 1881 due to the creek's flooding. The parcel numbers changed. Pendleton's promissory note references the old parcel numbers. If he had genuinely bought your debt from the Territorial Bank last week, the lien would reflect the updated 1,881 boundaries. He didn't buy your debt, Samir." Samir stared at her, the realization slowly dawning, cutting through the haze of his pain. "He forged it. He mocked up a fake lien using outdated county records to scare me off the land before the railroad buyers arrive." "It is a bluff," Claire whispered, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her tired face. "A bluff built on fraudulent paper. If we expose him to a federal judge, he won't just lose the land. He will go to a federal penitentiary." But their triumph was violently cut short. The sound of shattering glass exploded from the kitchen. Claire spun around as the back door was kicked open, the heavy wooden bar splintering inward. Cold wind and snow blasted into the room, followed by the hulking, bruised figure of Hiram, flanked by Sheriff Amos Sterling. Well, well, Hiram sneered, his eyes darting to Samir, who was trapped in the bed, weaponless. Looks like the blizzard didn't finish the job after all. Before Claire could lunge for the Winchester by the fireplace, Sheriff Sterling drew his revolver, leveling it directly at her chest. "Hold it right there, little lady. We ain't here for bloodshed. We're here on official county business. You have no jurisdiction here, Amos," Samir growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, helpless rage as he struggled to sit up, his broken leg burning with agony. "Get out of my house. Pendleton's patience has run dry," Sterling said, stepping into the room and shaking the snow from his coat. "The railroad men are in Sheridan. He needs the deed signed today. Since you didn't freeze to death, he sent us with a stronger incentive." Hiram stepped aside. Behind him, held tight in the grip of a third, unseen man, was Sadie. The little girl was crying silently, her eyes wide with terror. Her rag doll dropped in the snow by the porch. Caleb was locked in the woodshed outside. Claire could hear his muffled, frantic kicking against the door. Claire felt the blood freeze in her veins. "Let her go," she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "She is a child. She's collateral," Hiram corrected, grinning through a mouthful of broken teeth. "Pendleton says you bring the signed deed to his office in Oakhaven by 3 o'clock. You do that, you get the girl back, and you can pack your bags for Boston. You don't show." "Well, the orphanage in Cheyenne is a mighty cold place this time of year." Sterling tipped his hat. 3 o'clock, Lewis. Don't be late." They backed out of the door, taking Sadie with them. The sound of their horses galloping away over the crusted snow was like a hammer striking the final nail into a coffin. Samir roared in anguish, throwing the heavy quilts off and dragging his shattered leg over the side of the bed. "My gun! Claire, get my gun!" Claire stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at the open doorway. Then, the Boston propriety she had clung to finally, utterly shattered, replaced by the unforgiving steel of the Wyoming frontier. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She walked to the fireplace, grabbed the Winchester, and turned to her husband. "We are not giving him the land, Samir, and he is not keeping our daughter." The ride into Oakhaven was a grueling, agonizing descent from the high country, a journey measured not in miles, but in the slow, torturous crunch of wagon wheels breaking through crusted snow. Samir rode in the back of the buckboard, his hastily splinted leg propped atop a half-empty sack of oats. He had wrapped himself in a heavy buffalo robe, but his face was the color of old parchment, drawn tight with the kind of pain that could shatter a man's mind. His jaw was firmly locked, a muscle ticking relentlessly in his cheek, and his heavy Colt Peacemaker rested in his lap, his calloused thumb rhythmically stroking the hammer. Claire drove the team, her small frame swallowed by the oversized collar of Samir's spare canvas coat. The wind whipped her cheeks raw, but she barely felt the biting cold. Her mind was a singular, hyper-focused blade. Beneath the wooden seat, wrapped in a blanket, lay the Winchester rifle. Deep within the right pocket of her coat sat the small, silver Remington double Derringer, a secret purchase she had made from Miller's Mercantile weeks ago, meant for rattlesnakes, but destined for a far deadlier venom. They had made only one stop. At the county line, a ramshackle telegraph station sat huddled against the wind. Claire had left Samir in the wagon and marched inside, her boots tracking snow onto the warped floorboards. The shack smelled of stale chicory coffee and ozone. She had taken a blunt pencil and a scrap of paper, drawing heavily upon the 3 years she had spent clerking for her magistrate uncle in Boston. She drafted an urgent, coded wire to Judge Joseph Carey in Cheyenne. She detailed the fraudulent land patent, cited the specific federal statutes regarding the forgery of territorial assay seals, and reported the kidnapping of a minor across county lines. When she slid the paper across the counter, the half-deaf operator had squinted at the dense legal phrasing, then at her. "That'll be $2, ma'am," to send it express. Claire had reached into her small coin purse, her fingers brushing against the 40 cents she had arrived in Wyoming with, alongside the few coins Samir had given her for household emergencies. She placed $2 on the counter, every cent she had to her name. "Send it immediately," she had commanded, listening to the frantic, rhythmic clacking of the telegraph key before turning back out into the freezing wind. That clacking was her lifeline, but it would not save her daughter today. That burden rested solely on her own shoulders. It was 2:45 when the wagon finally rumbled onto the muddy, snow-slushed main thoroughfare of Oakhaven. The town was eerily, oppressively quiet. Word had already spread like a prairie fire that Arthur Pendleton was settling his final score with the Lewis. Sensible folks had barred their doors and shuttered their windows. The saloons were unnaturally silent. Even the stray dogs had vanished from the boardwalks. Claire pulled the exhausted team to a halt directly in front of the assayer's office, a pristine brick building that stood in stark, arrogant contrast to the rough timber structures around it. She engaged the brake and turned to look over her shoulder at her husband. Samir's eyes met hers. They were clouded with fever and agony, yet they burned with a terrifying, protective fire. "Stay here," Claire told him, her voice steady, brooking absolutely no argument. "If I am not out in 5 minutes, or if you hear a shot, you take the front door." Samir reached out with a sudden, desperate strength, his large hand clamping around her wrist. His grip was bruising, grounding her to the reality of the moment. "Claire," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. "If he touches you, if he hurts either of you." "He will not," Claire said softly. She reached out with her free hand, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair from his damp, feverish forehead. "He expects to see a frightened, penniless bride begging for scraps. I am going to show him exactly who I married. I am going to show him a Lewis." Samir's grip loosened, his thumb brushing over her pulse point before he let her go. Claire slipped her gloved hand into her heavy pocket, her fingers wrapping securely around the pearl handle of the Derringer. She stepped down from the wagon, her boots hitting the slushy mud with a heavy, resolute thud, and pushed through the thick, frosted glass doors of the office. The interior was stiflingly hot, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke from a roaring potbelly stove, expensive bay rum cologne, and the cloying scent of oiled leather. Arthur Pendleton sat behind a massive, polished mahogany desk, looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit. Hiram stood lounging by the heavy iron safe in the corner, a crude sneer splitting his bruised face, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. And there, in the corner farthest from the stove, tied securely to a straight-backed wooden chair, was little Sadie. The child's face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, her small shoulders shaking with silent, terrified sobs. Claire's heart slammed against her ribs, a violent surge of maternal fury threatening to overwhelm her composure. But she clamped down on it, forcing the ice of Boston propriety to freeze over the fire of the Wyoming frontier. She ignored the men entirely, walking straight toward the little girl. "Hold it right there, you crazy witch," Hiram barked, pushing off the safe and drawing his weapon, leveling it at Claire's back. Claire stopped, slowly turning to face the desk. Her eyes bypassed the hired gun and locked onto the wealthy merchant. "Ah, Claire." Arthur smiled, leaning back in his plush leather chair and steepling his fingers. He looked thoroughly delighted, punctual as always. "I see you brought the deed. And where is the crippled brute? Bleeding out in the back of the wagon, waiting for his betters to finish their business?" "I have not brought the deed, Mr. Pendleton," Claire said, her voice carrying clearly and calmly through the oppressive heat of the room. "I brought a message." Arthur's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his pale eyes narrowing. "If this is another display of your tiresome, moralizing self-righteousness, Claire, I assure you, my patience is completely exhausted. Sign the Blackwood Creek land over to me right now, or the girl leaves on the 4:15 train to the Cheyenne orphanage. You will never see her again." "You are a very careless man, Arthur," Claire said. She took a slow, deliberate step toward his desk. "When you forged that territorial bank lien, you utilized the 1,880 surveyor's map, a common mistake for someone who spends more time swindling than studying the law. You failed to realize the Federal Land Office officially redrew the parcel lines along the Bighorn foothills in the spring of 1881 due to the creek's shifting floodplain. The document you hold references non-existent boundaries. It is legally worthless. It is a fraud. Arthur's face paled abruptly, the healthy flush of victory draining away to leave him looking sickly and sharp. He threw a quick, nervous glance at Hiram, a flicker of genuine, naked panic breaking through his polished veneer. "You don't know what you're talking about, you ignorant little. I wired Judge Joseph Carey in Cheyenne 2 hours ago from the county line." Claire cut him off, her voice rising now, echoing with the absolute, unyielding authority of a magistrate's clerk passing sentence. "I cited the boundary discrepancy, the forged assay seal, and the interstate kidnapping of a minor. A federal marshal is currently boarding a Union Pacific train in Laramie. By tomorrow morning, this town will be swarming with men who answer to the United States government, not to your payroll." "She's lying," Hiram shouted, his face purpling with rage as he cocked the hammer of his revolver, pointing it directly at Claire's head. "She's bluffing. Shoot her, boss." "Shut up, Hiram," Arthur snapped, springing to his feet. His hands trembled slightly as he braced them against the mahogany desktop. He stared at Claire, searching her stoic, unwavering expression for a tell, a sign of weakness, a bluff. He found nothing but absolute ice. "You wouldn't dare. If I go down for this, Claire, I swear to God I take the girl with me." "No." A low, gravelly voice rumbled from the open doorway behind them, cutting through the heavy air like a scythe. "You don't." Hiram spun around. Samir leaned heavily against the doorframe, supporting his weight on a makeshift crutch, hastily carved from a broken pitchfork handle. He looked like an angel of death, pale as the snow outside, sweating profusely, his heavy coat hanging open to reveal the thick, blood-soaked bandages wrapping his ribs. But his eyes were a terrifying, piercing steel, and his hand holding the heavy Colt was as steady as a mountain stone. Hiram raised his weapon to fire, but Samir was impossibly faster. The thunderous, deafening roar of the .45 caliber Colt filled the small, enclosed office, rattling the glass in the windows. Hiram screamed, a high, reedy sound, dropping his gun as the heavy slug shattered his collarbone. The impact lifted the massive man off his feet and threw him backward, crashing violently into the iron safe before slumping to the floor in a groaning, bloody heap. Arthur panicked. Seeing his muscle neutralize, the last remnants of his civilized facade vanished. With a feral shout, he lunged across the wide desk, snatching a heavy, silver letter opener, his eyes darting frantically toward Sadie, intent on using the child as a shield. He never made it past the edge of the mahogany wood. Claire's hand whipped out of her deep coat pocket in a blur of motion. The small, deadly crack of the Remington double derringer was nearly swallowed by the ringing echoes of Samir's initial shot. But the result was immediate and devastating. Arthur Pendleton shrieked in sudden agony, clutching his thigh as the .41 caliber bullet tore through the expensive broadcloth of his trousers and bit deep into the muscle. He collapsed over the side of the desk, tumbling to the floor in a pathetic, writhing, whimpering heap, the silver letter opener clattering uselessly across the floorboards. Claire didn't spare the ruined merchant a second glance. The gun dropped to her side as she rushed to Sadie. She fell to her knees, her fingers shaking frantically as she worked the tight knots of the rough rope binding the child to the chair. The moment the ropes fell away, the little girl lunged forward with a heartbreaking sob, throwing her arms around Claire's neck and burying her face deep into the wool collar of the oversized coat. "I have you," Claire whispered fiercely, tears finally springing to her eyes as she wrapped her arms tightly around the small, trembling body, pressing a fervent kiss into the child's tangled, soot-stained hair. "Mama has you. You're safe." Heavy boots pounded on the boardwalk outside, and Sheriff Amos Sterling burst through the front door, his own revolver drawn. He skidded to a halt, taking in the chaotic scene. He looked at his hired muscle, Hiram, bleeding out by the safe. He looked at the wealthiest man in town, Arthur Pendleton, weeping and clutching a shattered leg on the rug. He looked at the towering, injured rancher aiming a smoking Colt directly at his chest, and finally, at the fierce Eastern woman shielding a crying child on the floor. "Sheriff," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly with the fading adrenaline, but cold and hard as the Wyoming permafrost. She didn't bother to stand, simply turning her head to pin the corrupt lawman with a lethal glare. "Mr. Pendleton is currently under federal indictment for fraud, forgery, and the kidnapping of a child. I highly suggest you arrest him immediately before the United States Marshals arrive tomorrow morning and begin asking very pointed questions about why the local law enforcement was complicit in his crimes." Amos Sterling was a deeply corrupt man, but he was inherently driven by self-preservation. He looked at Samir's unwavering gun, swallowed hard, and slowly, deliberately holstered his weapon. He pulled a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his belt and walked over to the whimpering Arthur Pendleton, hauling the ruined man up by his collar. As the sheriff dragged Pendleton out the door, Samir's remaining strength finally gave out. The Colt slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor, and he slid slowly down the doorframe until he was sitting on the floorboards, his head thrown back against the wood, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Claire scooped Sadie up into her arms and rushed across the room, dropping to her knees beside him. She settled onto the floor, pulling the little girl onto her lap, and leaned heavily against Samir's uninjured side. "You shot him," Samir breathed, turning his head to look at her. A faint, incredulous, profoundly exhausted smile touched his pale lips as he glanced down at the small silver derringer resting on her knee. "He was going to touch my daughter," Claire stated simply, her tone implying that it was the most natural, undeniable truth in the entire universe. Samir's eyes softened, the hard, impenetrable wall he had carried for years finally, permanently crumbling away. He reached out with his heavy, gunpowder-stained hand, pulling both Claire and Sadie tightly against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of Claire's neck, inhaling deeply. She smelled of biting winter wind, acrid gun smoke, and the fierce, undeniable scent of home. "I love you," Samir whispered. The words were rough, broken, and wet with unshed tears, a raw confession ripped from the deepest, most protected part of his soul. "Not a partnership, Claire. Not a contract to survive the winter. I love you." Claire closed her eyes, letting her own tears finally spill over her lashes, hot and fast against his skin. The tears washed away the lingering humiliation of the dusty train station, the paralyzing cold of the blizzard, and the terrifying fear of the past 24 hours. She turned her face, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to his rough cheek. "I know," she whispered back, resting her forehead against his, feeling the steady, enduring beat of his heart. "And I love you, Samir Lewis. Now, let us go home. Our son is waiting." Years later, the Blackwood Creek Ranch stood as a testament to the stubborn resilience of the frontier. The railroad had indeed come through, but thanks to Claire's sharp negotiations, the Lewis were paid handsomely for a small right-of-way that bypassed the main pastures. Arthur Pendleton died in a federal prison in Leavenworth, his grand ambitions reduced to dust. Claire and Samir built a sprawling, warm home filled with laughter. Caleb grew up to manage the vast herds alongside his father, while Sadie inherited her mother's fierce intellect, eventually traveling east to study law. The legend of the Boston bride who had arrived with 40 cents and a broken heart, only to conquer the wildest man in Wyoming, became a beloved piece of local history. It was a story not of a desperate arrangement, but of two shattered souls who found, in the harshness of the West, the strength to forge an unbreakable, enduring love.